Caligula, the name alone conjures images of absolute madness. The Roman emperor who made his horse a consul, who threatened to appoint his favorite stallion to the Senate, who built the bridge of boats across the Bay of Baia just so he could ride across it in defiance of a prophecy, who declared war on the god Neptune and ordered his soldiers to stab the sea with their swords and collect seashells as spoils of war, who slept with his sisters, tormented his nobles, and demanded to be worshipped as a living god. Caligula has become the benchmark of royal insanity, the standard against which other mad monarchs are measured. When we want to say that a ruler is insane, we say, he makes Caligula look sane. But here is the terrifying truth. Caligula was not the craziest king in history, not even close. There were rulers who made Caligula look like a model of restraint and rationality, rulers whose madness was not the product of absolute power corrupting a weak mind, but something deeper, darker, and more destructive. Rulers who tortured for pleasure, who killed for entertainment, who believed they were gods, demons, animals, or even werewolves. Rulers whose reigns were so bizarre, so terrifying, so utterly unhinged that history itself has struggled to explain them. Today, we are going to meet 10 of these rulers. 10 real-life mad kings who made Caligula look sane. From the emperor who burned his own city to the king who bathed in blood, from the sultan who drowned his entire harem to the tsar who personally tortured his subjects. These are not fictional villains, these are real historical figures. They sat on real thrones, they wielded real power. And they use that power in ways that defy rational explanation. Prepare yourself, because once you meet these mad kings, Caligula will seem positively reasonable. Mad King 1. Nero the emperor who burned Rome. Let us start with Rome itself, because Caligula was not the only mad emperor in Roman history. In fact, he was one of many, and his nephew, Nero, may have surpassed him. Nero became emperor in 54 AD, at the age of 16. His mother, Agrippina, had murdered her way to power, manipulating, poisoning, and scheming until her son sat on the throne. Nero was a sensitive, artistic young man. He loved music, poetry, and theater. He dreamed of being a performer, not a politician. But he was also deeply unstable. He had his own mother murdered. He kicked his pregnant wife to death in a fit of rage. He had his stepbrother poisoned at a dinner party. He was a murderer, a sadist, and a megalomaniac. And then, in 64 AD, came the Great Fire of Rome. The fire raged for 6 days and 7 nights. It destroyed 10 of the city's 14 districts. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. The ancient city of Rome was reduced to ashes. And according to the most famous account, Nero watched the fire from the top of his palace, playing the lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned has become one of the most enduring symbols of royal indifference and madness in history. Did Nero actually start the fire? Historians are divided. Some say yes. He wanted to clear the land to build his magnificent new palace, the Domus Aureale, the Golden House. Others say no. He was in Antium when the fire started, and he rushed back to organize the relief effort. The truth is uncertain, but what is certain is what happened after the fire. Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one, the Christians. He had them rounded up, tortured, and executed in the most spectacular and horrifying ways imaginable. Some were sewn into the skins of animals and torn apart by dogs, some were crucified, and some were covered in pitch, nailed to stakes, and set on fire to serve as human torches, lighting the gardens of the imperial palace, while Nero, in the garb of a charioteer, mingled with the guests and watched them burn. This was not justice. This was not punishment. This was entertainment. This was madness. Nero's reign ended in rebellion. The Senate declared him a public enemy. He fled Rome and eventually killed himself, reportedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." Even in death, he saw himself as a performer, a mad artist king who had turned his empire into a stage for his own violent fantasies. Mad King 2. Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar who killed his own son. From Rome, we travel to Russia, to the court of Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. The word terrible in Russian, Grozny, does not mean bad. It means awe-inspiring, fearsome, majestic. Ivan was all of those things. He was also, by any modern definition, profoundly mentally ill. Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 3. after his father died of a sudden illness. His childhood was a nightmare of political intrigue, violence, and neglect. He watched as the boyars, the powerful nobles, fought for power around him. He learned to trust no one. He grew up paranoid, suspicious, and cruel. When he was crowned Tsar of all Russia in 1547, he was already a deeply damaged man. His early reign was marked by reform and expansion. He conquered the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, opening the way for Russian expansion into Siberia. He modernized the army, reformed the law, and built the famous St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. But his paranoia grew. He became convinced that the boyars were plotting against him. He created a secret police force, the oprichniki, who wore black robes and rode black horses, carrying the severed heads of dogs and brooms, symbols of their mission to sniff out treason and sweep it away. The oprichniki terrorized Russia for over a decade. They tortured, executed, and massacred thousands of people. Entire cities were destroyed. Novgorod, the second city of the realm, was sacked and its population slaughtered on Ivan's orders. Tens of thousands died. The reign of terror reached its climax in 1581, when Ivan, in a fit of rage, struck his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his iron-tipped staff. The blow killed the young Tsarevich. The famous painting by Ilya Repin shows Ivan cradling his dying son, a look of wild horror and despair in his eyes. It is one of the most powerful images of royal madness ever created. Ivan the Terrible died 3 years later, while playing chess. His reign had been a nightmare of violence, paranoia, and bloodshed. He had made Russia great. He had also made it bleed. And he had killed his own son with his bare hands. Caligula never did that. Mad King III, the emperor of the caliphate who bathed in blood. Al-Hakim Bayamar Allah. From the frozen north, we travel to the warm, sophisticated world of the Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled Egypt and North Africa in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Fatimids were Ismaili Shia Muslims, claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima. They built Cairo. They founded the great University of Al-Azhar. They were patrons of art, science, and learning. And they produced one of the most bizarre and terrifying rulers in Islamic history. Al-Hakim Bayamar Allah, the sixth Fatimid Caliph, ruled from 996 to 1021. He was a complex, contradictory, and deeply unstable figure. He was a patron of learning, founding the House of Knowledge in Cairo, which was open to scholars of all faiths. He was also a ruthless persecutor. He issued bizarre decrees. He banned the eating of certain foods. He banned women from walking in the streets. He ordered the killing of all dogs in Cairo. He forced Christians and Jews to wear distinctive clothing, and then destroyed their churches and synagogues. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in Christendom, was destroyed on his orders, an act that shocked the Christian world and contributed to the climate that would eventually lead to the Crusades. Al-Hakim's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began to claim that he was not just the caliph, but a divine figure, the living embodiment of God on earth. His followers, a sect that would become known as the Druze, worshipped him as a deity. One night in 1021, Al-Hakim went for a walk in the hills outside Cairo. He never returned. His body was never found. Some say he was murdered by his own sister, who was tired of his madness. Others say he simply vanished, ascending to heaven like a prophet. The Druze, to this day, believe that Al-Hakim is not dead, but hidden, and will return at the end of time to usher in a new age, a mad caliph who became a god. Caligula, who merely demanded to be worshipped, would have been impressed. Mad King IV, the king who thought he was made of glass. Charles VI of France. Charles VI of France is a tragic figure, a man who began his reign with promise and ended it in madness. He was called Charles the Beloved in his youth. He was handsome, charming, and popular. He married Isabeau of Bavaria, a beautiful and intelligent princess. He seemed destined for a glorious reign. Then, in 1392, during a military campaign in the forest of Le Mans, Charles had a psychotic break. A page accidentally dropped a lance, which clattered against a helmet. The sudden noise triggered something in Charles. He drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several before he was overpowered. He was raving, foaming at the mouth, completely out of his mind. This was the first of many episodes. Over the following decades, Charles descended further and further into madness. He forgot his own name. He forgot that he was king. He forgot his wife and children. He refused to bathe or change his clothes for months at a time. He wandered the corridors of his palace, howling like a wolf. He believed that he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent himself from breaking. He sometimes believed he was St. George and would demand to be given a horse and a lance. Charles's madness plunged France into chaos. His uncles and cousins fought for control of the kingdom. The result was a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, which weakened France so severely that the English invaded and nearly conquered the entire country. The Battle of Agincourt, the English capture of Paris, the coronation of Henry V as heir to the French throne, all of this was made possible by the madness of one king. Charles died in 1422, a broken, pathetic figure, having reigned for 42 years, most of them in the grip of insanity. A mad king who cost France a century of war. Mad King V, the Sultan who drowned his harem. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire produced some of the most brilliant and effective rulers in world history. Suleiman the Magnificent, Mehmed the Conqueror, Selim the Grim. It's also produced some of the most profoundly disturbed. Ibrahim I, who ruled from 1640 to 1648, was known to history as Ibrahim the Mad. He was the younger brother of Murad IV, a brilliant but brutal sultan who had ordered the execution of his other brothers to secure his throne. Ibrahim was spared, but he was kept prisoner in the caves, the cage, a luxurious but isolated part of the palace where potential rivals to the throne were confined. Ibrahim spent his entire youth in the caves, living in constant fear that he would be executed at any moment. When Murad died in 1640, Ibrahim became sultan. The experience of lifelong imprisonment had driven him mad. He was paranoid, terrified, and utterly unfit to rule. His mother, Kaiksem Sultan, effectively ran the empire for him. But Ibrahim's madness was not just passive. It was active, aggressive, and deeply disturbing. He was obsessed with women. He had the Grand Vizier scour the empire for the most beautiful women to fill his harem. He was obsessed with furs. He had his entire palace decorated with sable fur, and forced his concubines to wear nothing else. He was obsessed with obesity. He had his agents search for the fattest woman in the empire, and when they found her, he made her his favorite. But the most famous act of madness attributed to Ibrahim is the drowning of his harem. The story goes that Ibrahim became convinced that one of his concubines had been unfaithful. Rather than punish just her, he ordered his entire harem, hundreds of women, to be tied up in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus to drown. The story is disputed by some historians, but it has become part of the legend of Ibrahim the Mad. He was eventually deposed and executed in 1648, strangled by the order of his own mother. A mad sultan, destroyed by his own madness. Mad King VI, the emperor who fought the Caligula's spiritual successor. We return to Rome for a moment because there was another emperor who rivaled Caligula in madness. His name was Commodus. You may know him as the villain of the movie Gladiator. The real Commodus was, if anything, worse than the movie version. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, one of the most respected rulers in Roman history. How did the son of such a great man become such a monster? No one knows. Perhaps it was the pressure of living up to his father's legacy. Perhaps it was a genuine mental illness. Whatever the cause, Commodus was unhinged. He believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He dressed in lion skins and carried a club. He fought as a gladiator in the arena, not as a symbolic act, but as a genuine obsession. He killed hundreds of animals and dozens of men in gladiatorial combat. He was, according to the historian Cassius Dio, a skilled but brutal fighter. The Roman people were horrified. Their emperor, the most powerful man in the world, was performing in the arena like a common slave. The Senate was terrified. Commodus executed anyone who displeased him. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. He demanded to be worshipped as a god. He was eventually assassinated in 192 AD, strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, hired by a conspiracy that included his own mistress. The Senate declared him a public enemy and ordered his memory erased. His name was chiseled off monuments. His statues were destroyed. The mad emperor was officially forgotten, but his legend lived on. Commodus was Caligula's spiritual successor, a man whose madness was so extreme that even the Romans, who had seen it all, could not believe what they were witnessing. Mad King 7. The prince who thought he was a werewolf, Peter the Wolf. From Rome, we travel to the dark forests of medieval Europe, where madness took on a supernatural dimension. The story of Peter the Wolf is shrouded in legend, but it has its roots in historical fact. Peter Stump, also known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, was a German farmer who lived in the late 16th century. He was accused, tried, and executed for a series of horrific crimes, including cannibalism, murder, and witchcraft. Under torture, he confessed to being a werewolf. He claimed that the devil had given him a magic belt that allowed him to transform into a wolf. As a wolf, he had killed and eaten dozens of people, including children. He had committed incest with his own daughter. He had killed his own son and eaten his brain. The confession was obtained under brutal torture, and it is impossible to know how much of it was true. That the trial and execution of Peter Stump were real. He was tortured on the rack, then executed in a particularly gruesome manner. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers. His limbs were broken with the wheel. He was beheaded, and his body was burned. His daughter and his mistress were also executed, burned at the stake. Peter Stump was not a king, he was a farmer, but his story illustrates the mindset of an age when the line between man and beast, between sanity and madness, between the natural and the supernatural, was terrifyingly thin. There were rulers who believed they were werewolves. There were rulers who believed they were gods, demons, animals. The madness of power could take many forms, and in a world where the supernatural was accepted as real, the madness could be even more terrifying. Mad King 8. The king who froze his army. Charles XII of Sweden. Charles XII of Sweden was not mad in the same way as Nero or Ibrahim. He was not a sadist or a megalomaniac. He was a brilliant military commander, one of the greatest of his age. He became king at the age of 15. He defeated a coalition of Denmark, Poland, and Russia in a series of stunning victories. He was feared across Europe, but his brilliance was paired with a fatal flaw. He was utterly incapable of admitting defeat. He was obsessed with victory. He was convinced that he was destined to be a great conqueror, like Alexander the Great. This obsession led him to invade Russia in 1708, a decision that would prove catastrophic. The Russian winter destroyed his army. The Battle of Poltava, in 1709, was a crushing defeat. Charles fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he spent years in exile, trying to convince the Sultan to ally with him against Russia. He eventually returned to Sweden, only to immediately launch a new war against Norway. In 1718, during the siege of Fredrikstad Fortress, Charles was killed by a bullet to the head. He was 36 years old. The circumstances of his death are still debated. Was he killed by enemy fire? Or was he assassinated by one of his own men, tired of a king who would never stop fighting? Charles XII was not insane in the clinical sense, but his obsessive, reckless, self-destructive pursuit of war, his refusal to accept reality, his willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own people, for the sake of military glory, that is a form of madness. A madness that was so extreme that it made Caligula, who at least had the excuse of being a pampered prince, look almost rational. Mad King 9. The emperor who made his horse a consul. The original Mad King. We have to talk about Caligula. He is the benchmark, the standard against which all other mad kings are measured. His name has become a byword for absolute power corrupting absolutely. But what did Caligula actually do? Let us list the most famous accusations. He made his horse, Incitatus, a consul. He built a bridge across the Bay of Baia. He declared war on Neptune, and ordered his soldiers to stab the sea. He slept with his sisters. He had his subjects executed on a whim. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. Some of these accusations are probably true, some are probably exaggerated. The Roman historians who recorded Caligula's crimes were writing after his death, and they had every reason to portray him as a monster. The Senate had ordered his memory erased. The historians were writing for emperors who wanted Caligula to be remembered as the worst possible example of tyranny. So, we have to take the stories with a grain of salt. That the sheer volume of accusations and the consistency of the portrait that emerges suggests that Caligula was genuinely unstable. He was a young man, raised in a family of murderers and schemers, who was suddenly given absolute power, it drove him insane. Whether he actually made his horse a consul or not, the fact that the story was believable tells you everything you need to know about his reputation. Caligula was the original mad king, the template, the archetype. And every mad king who came after him was measured against his legacy. Part 10. The lesson of the mad kings. What power does to the human mind. So, what have we learned from these 10 mad kings? We have learned that absolute power is a poison. It corrodes the mind. It distorts reality. It removes the checks and balances that keep normal human beings grounded. A person who is never told no, who is surrounded by sycophants and flatterers, who can indulge every whim without consequence, will eventually lose touch with reality. That is the lesson of Caligula, of Nero, of Ivan, of Ibrahim. Power did not make these men mad. It revealed the madness that was already there, and it gave it free rein. We have also learned that madness takes many forms. It can be sadistic, like Nero; paranoid, like Ivan; religious, like Al-Hakim; melancholy, like Charles VI; sexual, like Ibrahim; narcissistic, like Commodus; obsessive, like Charles XII. There is no single type of mad king. There is only the common thread of power, used without restraint, without accountability, without empathy. The mad kings are a warning about what happens when human beings are given too much power. A warning that is as relevant today as it was in ancient Rome. The mad kings are not just historical curiosities. They are a mirror that shows us the dark side of human nature. The side that we would prefer to ignore, the side that emerges when the restraints are removed. That is why we are fascinated by them. That is why we tell their stories. Because they show us what we could become if we were given the same power and the same madness. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, leave a comment. Which of these mad kings do you think was the most terrifying? Like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves history. I will see you in the next one.